All right, so the next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to incorporate user authentication into a navigation bar, right? We've seen how to incorporate user authentication into our routing components, right? If we open up auth route and unauth route, basically both of these routes just took into account whether or not the user was logged in and behaved differently accordingly. So what we're going to take a look at now is we're going to see how to basically add a nav bar to our application that basically will react differently depending on whether the user is logged in or not. So what this is going to look like more or less is we're going to have, our basic navbar component. It'll have some kind of logo thing over on the side, right? Some kind of site header. And over here, it's going to have different buttons depending on whether or not the user's logged in, right? So if the user is currently logged out, we're going to want to display two buttons here, one which will allow the user to log in, and one which will allow the user to sign up, okay, or create an account, right? Now, on the other hand, if the user is already logged in, what we're going to want to do is we're just going to want to display a logout button, if you can read that. And we're probably also going to want to display the email address that the user is currently logged in with here. So we'll say something like logged in as blah, blah, blah. Basically what we're doing on the home page already, except, it'll be in a much more visible place so that they can know who they're logged in as all the time. Okay, so that's going to be our basic plan of attack with our nav bar, but the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to pull our logout button out into its own separate component. So let's just close these things here, and inside our components, we're going to create a new file called logout.button.js. And essentially, this is just going to encapsulate the logic for logging a user out. So we've already done this inside our home page. So after we've created this, we're just going to go back in and replace that button and that logic with this logout button. But what this is going to look like essentially is we're going to say import get auth and sign out. We've seen both those functions before from Firebase/auth. And then our logout button component is going to look like this. We'll say export const logout button equals. And inside here, we're basically going to define the same logout function that we had earlier. We'll say const logout equals. It's going to be an async function. And we're going to say const auth equals get auth. We're going to say await sign out auth. And then we're going to say alert successfully logged out. Okay, and then all we really need to do is return a button that will call that function. So we'll say return button on click equals log out. And the button itself is going to say log out. And that's really all we need to do. So let's go back into our home page now. We're going to open up homepage.js. We're going to remove this logout logic and the console log as well, which I forgot about. And we're also going to remove this logout button here and the imports. And instead, we're just going to import the logout button from our components/logout button and put that down here instead. So we'll just say logout button like that. And this basically allows us to insert this logout button anywhere we want to. We're going to be able to just insert it into the nav bar just by importing this component and displaying it like that without having to worry about having any kind of Firebase auth logic inside our nav bar. Now that we've done that, one more thing that I'm going to do is actually just delete this you are logged in as user email, since we're going to now be displaying that up in our nav bar. So I'm just going to delete that here. And in our components now, let's create a new file for our nav bar. This is going to be pretty straightforward. We're just going to say import logout button from logout button. We're going to export our navbar component like this. And our navbar, just like our home page, is actually going to have to take a user prop, since essentially this will allow our navbar to know whether the user's logged in or not. And it will also allow us to get the user's current email, which we want to display. So we're just going to say user for the prop. And inside here, we'll say return. We're going to add just a nav element in there with some links. So we're going to need to add, we're going to need to import the link component from React Router DOM as well. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is display the app heading. This is just going to be a link here that says to. It's going to be to the home route, and we'll just use auth example as our app title. And under that, what we're going to do is basically we're going to check whether or not this user exists and display the corresponding buttons accordingly. So we're going to have curly braces here. We're going to say user, and we're going to use a ternary operator to basically display different JSX here depending on whether or not the user exists. So if the user exists, remember, we want to just display the user's email and the logout button. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say paragraph, and we'll display the user's email. We'll say logged in as here, user.email. And under that, we're going to display the logout button. So we'll say logout button, and we need to wrap this inside a React fragment like that. Okay, so that's if the user is logged in. If the user is not logged in, remember we want to display links to both the create account and login pages. These are going to look like buttons, but essentially they're just going to be links. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say fragments, oops. And inside here, we're going to have a link to the login page. So we'll say /login. Inside this link, we're going to have a button, which will say log in. And under that, we're going to have a link to the create account page. And this button will say create account. All right, and that's our nav bar. So let's display this thing inside our app component here. We're going to basically import navbar from its file. So from ./components/navbar. Let's actually put this up here with the rest of the components. And then in order to get this to display, we just need to put it outside of the switch down here in our JSX. So we'll just say navbar like that. We're going to pass the user through as a prop. And now if we go back and take a look at our application, we should see auth example, which takes us to the home route, logged in as sean5@gmail.com, and we have the log out button. And yes, this is our nav bar. It's not very good looking. We'll have to come back and add some styles to it. But it does work. If we click log out, as you'll see, we'll see successfully logged out. And this will change to log in and create an account, which will take us to those corresponding pages. Okay. And also, auth example doesn't work right now because we're trying to go to the home page essentially, but it's redirecting us right back to the login page. All right, so that's our nav bar. Let's use this opportunity to actually add a few styles to our application since it's really, really ugly right now. So here's what this is going to look like. I'm just going to open up the index.css file of our project, and I'm going to add a few key styles. So first of all, we're going to style our inputs and buttons, and I'm just going to copy and paste some typical styling for those so that it'll look the same as the rest of our application, right? Same font size, etc. We're going to do something similar for our anchor tags. This will be the link components that we're displaying. For this one, we're just going to set it to display block so that each one will be on its own line. For margin bottom, we're going to set 8 pixels so that there will be spacing between that and the next thing when it's displayed, let's say, in the create account or login pages. We're just going to give it a little bit of padding to make it look more like the buttons. We're going to give it text align center. And we're going to give it width 100%, just like we had up here on the input and buttons. Now, normally you probably won't want to do this. You'll probably want to add new classes and stuff like that for width 100% for your buttons and links, but since most of our application is just those things at this point, it's not really that big of a deal. So that's the styling for our input and buttons. One last thing is for our button. Right, for all the buttons in our application, we're going to want to say cursor pointer. What else? Let's add a few more styles now for our nav bar. Basically what this is going to look like, and I'm just going to add them right in index.css too. You could do it with CSS modules or styled components if you wanted to. What we're going to do, I'm just going to say nav, and I'm going to say display flex, and I'll also give it just a nice little border bottom there. We'll say 2 pix solid, and we'll do a light gray color. We'll do like CCC, something like that. And that will basically make all of the items inside the nav bar be displayed on the same line, evenly spaced. So the next thing is we're going to say nav A. This will basically be all of the anchor tags, all of the links inside the nav bar. We're going to say color, inherit, and text decoration none. This will basically get rid of the blue or purple, 1990s internet styling that is still on our application right now. That'll get rid of that when it's on our nav bar. Next thing we're going to say, we're going to add a class here for our app heading, right? That's the title in our nav bar. That's just going to be flex, and we can do 7 or 8 or something like that. That'll really just make sure that that takes up the majority of the spacing in the nav bar. And other than that, we're just going to make sure that the h1 tag inside the app heading. So we'll say app heading h1. We'll say text align left. And we're going to add a nav button class here, which will be our login, log out, etc. buttons. That's just going to be flex 1 there. Okay? So that's pretty much all the classes that we need right now. Let's just go back and add those to their corresponding elements inside our nav bar and the corresponding pages. The nav bar is really the main one that we need. So for app heading, for example, we're just going to want to add that up here. All right, so inside link, we're just going to say class name equals app-heading. Down here, then, for our logout button, we're going to wrap that in a div with the class name of nav button. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing now for our login and create account buttons here. We're just going to add that same class to these links. We'll say class name equals nav button and class name equals nav button. All right, so let's go back and take a look at our app so far. It's looking a little better, although this actually looks terrible. For some reason, this auth example is teeny tiny. Oh, and that's because we never actually wrapped this in an h1 tag. Okay, so we're just going to wrap that there. h1, that should make it look a lot better. And sure enough, now it's in its proper place. We see that our buttons are now the right size, right? We can click on login, create account. If we're already logged in here, let's just enter in something like this, sean5@gmail.com, abc123, log in. And that doesn't look the greatest, but we'll just leave it for now. Feel free to add a margin to that if you like. And everything looks like it's working well. Okay, so the only other thing that we have to change here, right? I want to actually put the login and create account pages inside their own container so that they're not the entire width of the page, because that, quite frankly, looks pretty bad. So all we need to do for that now is just go into our app component, and we're going to basically wrap our switch component in a div with the class name of centered container. Okay, so we'll close that off down here now, indent our switch, and then we just need to add a centered container class here. So we'll say centered container. For this one, we're just going to give it a max width of something like, I don't know, let's do 600 pix. And we'll say margin auto, and that should center it very nicely for us. So sure enough, that looks more like your average login or create account pages. And if we actually do log in now, if we say sean@gmail.com, abc123, log in, we'll see that the home page has that same styling as well. Cool. So now we have a nice styled application. Feel free to go through and actually add some more exciting styles here. As you may know by now, I'm not big on getting fancy with styling while doing courses. I'm happy with the minimal amount of styling here. So again, feel free to go through and add all of your own, add your own brand colors, etc. But anyway, we now have a nice nav bar for our application that responds according to, whether the user is logged in or not. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.